Welcome to the Security Champions Online, everybody, and thank you for joining us. The topic of discussion for today is psychological warfare. I will be a moderator. I'm Shriyan Ramsmooch. I'm currently based at Grenard Bank, and I'm a cybersecurity professional. And I'm joined by my two panelists, Ross Saunders and Steve Jump. Ross and Steve, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourselves?
Great. Well, I'll jump in first. My name's Ross, and I work in predominantly the privacy and cybersecurity space, so kind of straddling both of those, and act as a outsourced CISO for a lot of companies, particularly in the software space. So deal with these challenges quite a bit.
Thank you, Ross.
I'm Steve Jump. I work in the cybersecurity risk and advisory space, where I talk to lots of CISOs, try and align them with the risk perspective of cybersecurity, and help them to grow and train their staff into managing the massive problems that we face in the world of cybersecurity.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, I think let's jump right in. The first question that I would like to ask yourself and Ross. Do we feel that our defenses are currently adequate, bearing in mind that the current attacks are focused on the human factor, which are weaknesses and susceptibilities, and not the technology?
Okay, can I go first?
Go.
Yes.
Sure. This is a leading question, and it's a very hot topic. It's an area that is very, very much overhyped, I believe. But the reality is you are always going to be better off if you've got informed and aware staff. So security awareness is a vital part of everyone's plan. However, I'm one of those people who acknowledge that the term human firewall is there, but if you're going to consider it to be real, you have to consider it as part of a layered defense. So your people will always be the target. If you fail to put in appropriate preventive and detective technologies, it's not going to be pretty. So the reality is it's always going to be about the technology, and that technology can be assisted by smart, trained people, but you cannot replace it. In fact, it's unfair to assume that your human firewall is infinitely reprogrammable. So you need to make sure that your existing layers are there and understand the flaws as normal. It's just another part of your risk treatment.
So Steve, would you recommend that we, when using technology, our technology stack, that we try and mitigate as much as possible, or well, we'll never eliminate it, but mitigate the human factor?
I don't think you can ever totally mitigate it, but you have to accept mistakes will always be made, and you factor that in your cyber protection.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Ross?
I think what he said is great. The thing is, I think you've got to be holistic in this. You can't just see each in isolation, where you've got tech in one silo and people in another silo and things like that. You need to take an approach where you are addressing it all in this holistic ecosystem that is the security of an organization. You don't want to rely on one specific thing, but tech is a big part of it. Yes, though, that the human factor is there, but people do make mistakes. You can be on top of your game most days, and then one day you just have a slip up, and then you've got a problem. So in order for having adequacy, it needs to be across the board.
I agree with you, because cybersecurity cannot be siloed. Okay, on to the next topic. Okay, so there's been quite an increase of man-in-the-middle and phishing attacks. This is typically when there's a business email compromise, BEC, resulting in the compromise of one domain, which is then used to perpetrate phishing attacks on other organizations. In your experience, have you come across any such attacks? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Very much so. If I jump in.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is something that's seen pretty common, and phishing is just, it's across the board. And I think with everything happening with coronavirus, we're seeing so much of it, so much more of it coming out. But it's definitely something that's seen. I've helped on a number of instances where this takes place. And it's again, bringing into that psychological warfare sort of space, it's also the trust factor that's in here, because a blind phishing email is one thing. But when you have these targeted phishing emails, or it's phishing within an organization, and people say, well, oh, no, I trust that person sending me this email. Let me open it and enter my credentials. That's where the psychological tide comes in as well. But it's definitely something that we see, and we see often. It's a scary space to be in. And the breaches that happen from this happen in seconds.
Yes, I think it's very quick when you're in the wrong state of mind to actually not consider something carefully before opening it, and could happen to anybody. Steve, have you had any experiences with BEC?
Yes, multiple levels. Actually, you asked a very sneaky question there, because you're tackling 4 or 5 different dimensions. So we have phishing, okay? Phishing is common, it's cheap, it's easy, it's designed to obtain a working credential. And obviously, the more senior or the more authorized that person is, the higher value the target. So it is psychological. It is social engineering at its most brutal form. And it's often backed up by phone calls, video chats, and the emails. So it's not subtle, and it's quite effective. So obviously, getting that identity is going to be the problem. So we've got the technical measures, multi-factor authentication, all of those things that can really minimize or make it difficult. But the second part that you're talking about, the sort of the business email compromise, man in the middle, where someone can actually get in. The classic on this is where, if I know that you are sending an invoice to a customer, and I can find some way of changing the bank payment details on that invoice. Or better yet, just phone the customer and say, sorry, we've a mistake, we've changed our details. There are means to protect that, but you have to be aware that it's likely. And as with all of these things, the best defense is to actually make your communication effective, not to rely totally on the electronic media. And as Ross points out, there's a trust layer here. And you have to make sure that that trust layer is being used in your favor, or it will be exploited against you.
I think if I can add to that too, Steve, we also see it internally at companies where, for example, the CFO is spoofed and they change salary details. And then it's not only invoices, it's salary that gets paid somewhere else too.
Yeah, and part of that, back to communication. If your organization's culture is such that it has a restrictive or intolerant hierarchy, so if you think you've received an email from the CFO, and under normal circumstances, the PA would never think to contact the CFO, you have an organizational gap that can be exploited. Where this type of thing is effective, there is almost always an underlying internal communication problem. And that can be a trust, and it can be, I'd say, an outdated authoritarian management structure. These are all vulnerable. The more brittle your social structure in your company, the more fragile it is. So these are all lessons that we need to start adapting to a world where communication is up and down as well as side to side. And unfortunately, many people only discover that after it's broken.
That's an excellent point there. Thanks, Steve. I like your point with regards to the gap in communication. So, what some organizations do, including ours, is when we get a request for payment, then we contact the client telephonically. So there's that additional factor, if you could call it, of authorization to make sure that the request came from that client.
We do actually have some better tools at our disposal now the mere fact that we're holding this conference over a virtual channel is you do not need to just rely on a random phone number. You can actually talk to that person. And I don't want to pick on any particular countries to name, but let's just say if the person you're talking to does not have the ethnicity that you would normally expect, you have reason to be suspicious. In this particular circumstances, you should be using the tools at your disposal. And that also builds trust between you and your customers. So it has two advantages: finding the bad guys and proving that you're competent.
Great, thanks, Steve. Okay, I think we can go on to the next topic. Okay, this one's going to be an interesting one. Has the team ever performed a cost analysis after experiencing a social engineering incident? And were there any baseline cost analysis performed?
You love these two-part questions, don't you? I think it's great, Shane. You're opening us up to an intellectual challenge. May I go first?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Everyone who has been attacked picks up the pieces afterwards, and they are usually amazed in the most negative way at how much it actually costs. So if you haven't had a look at it, quite often you're going to have some kind of incident-induced outage, which can be hours, days, or weeks where you are not able to provide a service to your customer. So that's going to have a negative impact. It's going to be a loss of revenue. It's going to be basically your revenue chain could stop completely or be reduced. You will then also have some kind of remediation. You will have to try and get your customers back, which is increased or refocused marketing, rebuilding trust. That's not cheap. And almost always, you will have pressed the panic button and brought in outside people, such as myself, who come on board with my parachute and Superman cape. I tend not to be too cheap a resource for that kind of thing, but at value. You will find that those people that you bring on board, from your coordinators, incident commanders, and your external cybersecurity, forensic, and recovery teams, that you're going to be spending between 10 and 100 times more than your normal business run cost to support that situation. So it's going to be nasty. Plus, there will be changes in trade. The second part of this, baseline cost analysis. If you have not already had these conversations about how much would an incident cost, I cannot understand how you could have worked out what to spend and what to prioritize your actual security defense systems on. It boggles the mind. So if you do not know what you are protecting, believe me, there are people out there who will sell you any solution at any cost, and the only thing they're interested in is where your budget is. If you haven't had that conversation, you don't know where your budget is. So in other terms, you could say that your security expenditure may actually be reckless and untargeted. Topic of conversation for a different time. But expecting recovery costs and actually paying those recovery costs should an incident happen shouldn't be a total surprise.
Yeah. If I may jump in there with some examples as well.
Yeah, please go ahead, Ross.
So I think in the space that I play in a lot, I play around GDPR compliance and POPI compliance and things like that. And often the view of the client or whoever that's having an incident is that, oh, the fines, what's going to be the fines and the regulatory kind of thing. But it's not just that. And like Steve very rightly said, it's very broad. It's your operational cost. It's your opportunity cost that you lose when you've got downtime. It is costs for attorneys, for forensics. It really mushrooms. And I think I'm going to allude to another topic that's probably also a discussion at another time. But time is of the essence when something like this happens. So you need to know that you can detect and you need to know that you can respond. So if you don't have something where, like Steve said, you've considered the costs of what it costs you to be down, but you need to work out what your incident response is. Like, who do you contact? Because the longer you wait in this kind of situation, the more expensive it gets. I dealt with a very small company, 20 people, and they had a phishing attack, and it wasn't really successful. It was caught really early, and it was contained within an hour and a half. But the costs of recovery over the next 2 days were in the hundreds of thousands, just simply for those legal costs and the opportunity costs. So it's really expensive. You need to know what you're looking at in your own business.
Thanks, Ross. I think the other thing that Steve touched on is rebuilding trust. So your brand reputational costs, which are not tangible, is something which is really, really critical to this, and something which never may recover from such an attack, depending on what the attack was. I think it's also important to make sure that you get support from your your C-level executives in terms of budget spend, so that you're well equipped to spend on technology where you need to.
I'll just add to that. There is often a focus on the technology, because that's the high ticket item. The main thing is the budget to buy the toys. But the reality is, if your exco is not fully aware of the risk implications, and I use that risk in many capitals and exclamation marks that I can put into my voice here, that risk is a business construct. It is not a technology construct. What happens to my business if this goes wrong? Only if business is bought into the fact that this is a risk, and as such a risk, you can change the likelihood and you can change the magnitude. But without unrealistic expenditure, you can never, ever totally prevent the possibility of it occurring. You have to treat cybersecurity and information security and need privacy risk on exactly that same frame. Recognize the likelihood that it could happen, make prudent estimates and evaluations, act accordingly, and then review it. If something happens, find out, was it more or less than you thought? But these are business level conversations. They are not technological conversations. If you're only having an IT security conversation with the people in IT, you probably don't have any money left, and you may not have the protection that you think you bought for your company.
Excellent points. Thank you, Steve. Is there anything else to add in this one, or can we jump through to the next one?
I think Steve has covered that beautifully as to it's across the board. If you're siloed in the compliance department or the IT department, you've already lost the battle there.
Agreed. Okay, thanks, gentlemen. On to the next one. And this is the last topic for today. How do you ensure that your users are making use of the best practice security controls which you have taught them? And Steve's gonna love this because it's another two-part question. Do your users understand why these controls are required?
Well, I'm going to be really polite. I think Ross needs a chance to get the meat off.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say, well, how much force do you want to use with your users? It's, again, you can't take this, I think, as something that's viewed in isolation. It's not just what you've taught the users. You have to, there's a maturity level as to whether you've automated some of the controls or things like that. You can have the greatest policies in the world, but people can choose not to follow them. So you want to have some sort of, I think, automation in a more mature space where certain things are out of the hands of relying on a user to comply with a policy or a checklist item. If you take into consideration like something as simple as a password reset, you can have in policy that someone has to reset their password every 45 days. Whether they do that or not, if you don't have Active Directory or something maintaining it, is a whole different question. And if you start getting in magnitudes of users, it becomes impossible to police that kind of thing. So I think there are ways that you need to automate what you can, but then there is the education part. And to speak to the second part of your question, do the users understand why? Why is very important over what, because you can tell someone what to do and they can do it begrudgingly. If they understand why they should do it, it's a much easier way of implementing. Steve, I'll hand over to you. Your thoughts?
Oh, I think you set me up very nicely there, Ross. Basically, I'm going to start everything Ross just said, but I'm going to extend that. A user,
please do.
That is not just the person who is sat there connecting to Word and Outlook, okay? A user is everybody who has access to your information systems. So I would include in users those small sector of highly empowered technical acolytes that we call the administrative users, your privileged users. And don't forget, a privileged user might be authenticated as a privileged user, not just technically competent. It is highly likely that your CFO in your organization, even your chief executive, chief operating officer, is going to have a level of technical access to information systems that is extremely high. So your controls quite often are effected inside the business systems. They have to give you protection, they have to give you threat identification, they have to be able to monitor effective actions. And at the same time, they must not be getting in the way of effective business, because failed controls are usually the ones that get in the way of business, so they're ignorable. Ross just put a minor hook into Active Directory, bugbear of mine right now. A majority of massive security breaches from simple phishing are extended from the simple fact that people have not been protecting their Active Directory. It literally is your grandfather's axe, or your great-grandfather's axe, okay, where your grandfather and your father replaced the handle and your aunt replaced the head after she'd used it on him. And the reality is any and everything that was ever in your Active Directory from day one is probably still there, including, and here's a hint, if you have not looked at who has administrative privileges in Active Directory, you're going to be terrified, and I suggest you look as soon as you can, because if you've never run that control clean, you could find that 70% of your active staff have the ability to run commands and install software at an administrator level. Combine that with phishing, you're already toast. Yeah, forget the mushroom cloud, there's nothing left to burn, all right? These are controls at a technical level. Understanding why they're there helps to reduce the friction between IT and business. So these controls need to make sense. My favorite way of explaining controls is to use any employees, up to and including the CEO's bank account as an example. Do you want anybody stealing your password, stealing your money, taking the deeds for your house and using it to sell it from underneath you? All of these things are personal, but there's an analog to every one of them in the business environment. When you can make that correlation, it's still going to be difficult, but you will have a point of contact. Don't assume because you have a control in a policy that anything is actually happening.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Steve and Ross. I think we're almost out of time. Are there any last comments to wrap up?
I think from my side, I think it's just, you've got to be aware of the human side of things in this. And we talk about the psychological side. It really does come down to a human element. There's an empathy element. There's the understanding of why. But you need to view this all as an ecosystem, as the ecosystem that it is.
Thanks, Ross. Steve, anything from you?
Yes, don't underestimate the psychology factor, the social engineering that will be used to harm you, the internal social culture that may inhibit your staff at any level from reporting something they think is unusual, and poorly implemented technical controls that don't work properly, and people start to accept that improper function as normal. that's a bit like getting them used to the fact, like classic point, your internal certificates always give an error. So you're taught to basically accept faulty certificates.
That's a great example, Steve.
That's a bit like telling your children to always go with strangers. It's that bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve and Ross. Thank you everyone for watching, and we hope that you've learned some valuable lessons from our talk. Thank you.
Thank you.